In the summer of 1731, somewhere in the warm blue waters of the Caribbean, a British merchant captain stood helpless on the deck of his ship as Spanish coast guards closed in. They weren't looking for polite paperwork. They were looking for contraband, for hidden cargo, for proof that Britain's merchants were cheating Spain out of its empire. They tore the vessel apart. They interrogated the crew. And then, in a moment that would echo all the way to the halls of Parliament, a Spanish officer drew his blade and sliced off the captain's ear. The captain's name was Robert Jenkins, and years later, when he walked into the British Parliament and displayed what he claimed was that severed ear, Britain didn't just see a mutilated sailor. It saw humiliation. It saw insult. It saw Spain's hand on Britain's throat. An ear became a symbol. A grievance became a rallying cry, and a quarrel over trade and smuggling ignited a war that would spread across oceans, drag in empires, and merge into one of the great global clashes of the 18th century. This is the War of Jenkins Ear, and it was never really about an ear. It begins with a problem that had been simmering for decades. Spain's empire in the Americas was vast, wealthy, and vulnerable. From Mexico to Peru, from the Caribbean islands to the ports of Florida, Spanish silver and sugar moved across sea lanes that were too long to guard and too tempting to ignore. Spain tried to protect its monopoly with laws that said, in effect, Spanish colonies traded only with Spain. But the world didn't work that way. British, Dutch, and French merchants saw Spanish America as a locked treasure chest, and in the Caribbean, locks had a way of breaking. Britain, especially, had both the ships and the appetite. By the early 1700s, British merchants were deeply involved in illicit trade with Spanish colonies. They sold textiles, tools, rum, and enslaved Africans. They bought silver, cocoa, tobacco, and sugar. Smuggling wasn't a side business, it was the business, and it was often done with a wink from colonial officials who wanted goods, wanted profit, and wanted plausible deniability. After the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1713, Britain extracted something that looked like a legal doorway into Spain's closed empire. In the Treaty of Utrecht, Britain gained the asiento, the contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. The contract was managed by the South Sea Company. On paper, it was a regulated business arrangement. In practice, it became a smuggler's dream. Along with the asiento came another privilege, the right to send one official trading ship each year to Spanish America, the so-called navío de permiso. One ship, one voyage, one legal opening. But one ship could be stuffed with far more than permitted goods, and once the door cracked open, smaller boats and hidden cargo could slip through. Spanish officials knew it, British merchants knew it, everyone knew it. Spain's response was predictable. It tried to tighten control. It sent patrol ships, the guardacostas, to intercept smugglers. It authorized searches. It seized cargoes. It arrested crews. And in the murky world of Caribbean enforcement, those encounters were often brutal, corrupt, and personal. British captains claimed Spanish officers were pirates with paperwork. Spanish officers claimed British captains were pirates with flags. In 1731, Robert Jenkins was captain of a British brig called the Rebecca. Accounts differ in the details, as they often do when myth is being born, but the core story is consistent. Jenkins was stopped by Spanish coast guards near Cuba. His ship was searched, his cargo was questioned, and during the confrontation, Jenkins was mutilated. The Spanish commander, commonly identified as Juan de Leon Fandino, allegedly held up the severed ear and told Jenkins to take it to his king and tell him the same would happen to any British man caught trading illegally. Whether those exact words were spoken matters less than the fact that the story spread. In the Caribbean, tales of Spanish cruelty traveled fast. In Britain, they traveled faster, carried by merchants furious about lost profits and by politicians eager for a cause. But for years, nothing exploded.
The Ear incident happened in 1731. The war didn't begin until 1739. That gap is the key to understanding what was really happening. Because this wasn't a sudden burst of anger. It was a slow, deliberate drift toward war, powered by economics, politics, and national pride.
In London, Prime Minister Robert Walpole tried to keep Britain out of a major war. Walpole understood the cost. He understood that Britain's prosperity depended on trade, and trade depended on stability. He also understood that once the drums started, they were hard to silence. Walpole was not blind to Spanish abuses, but he preferred negotiation, compensation, and treaties. His opponents preferred something else. In Parliament and in the press, a chorus grew louder year by year. Merchants demanded protection, politicians demanded honor, newspapers printed stories of British sailors whipped, imprisoned, and robbed by Spanish patrols. The public imagination filled with images of Spanish cruelty and British victimhood. The old anti-Spanish prejudices, rooted in centuries of rivalry and Protestant fear of Catholic power, flared back to life. And then there were the so-called Patriot Whigs and other opposition figures who saw war as both righteous and useful. War would weaken Spain. War would open markets. War would make careers. It would also embarrass Walpole, who was increasingly portrayed as timid, corrupt, and too willing to accept insults. Spain, for its part, believed it was defending its lawful empire against a nation that treated treaties like suggestions. Spanish officials argued, with some justification, that Britain's legal treating rights were being used as cover for massive smuggling. They pointed to the South Sea Company, which was supposed to supply enslaved people and conduct limited trade, but which many Spaniards viewed as a smuggling machine. Tensions rose further in 1738, when the two empires tried to settle their disputes with a diplomatic agreement known as the Convention of Pardo. The idea was simple. Spain would compensate Britain for seized ships. Britain would compensate Spain for unpaid obligations and smuggling-related disputes. In theory, it was a compromise. In practice, it satisfied almost no one. British merchants wanted more than money. They wanted freedom to trade. They wanted Spain's coast guards restrained. They wanted the Caribbean opened wide. Spain wanted Britain to stop smuggling and to pay what it owed. Both sides suspected the other would cheat. And in London, the Convention of Pardo was attacked as a humiliating surrender. This is where Robert Jenkins re-enters the story, like a ghost summoned for political theater. In 1738, Jenkins was called to testify before Parliament. The legend says he produced his preserved ear, wrapped and kept as evidence of Spanish barbarity. Whether he actually displayed it is debated, but the image was irresistible. A mutilated captain standing before the nation's leaders, proof in flesh that Spain had crossed a line. It was propaganda gold. It turned complex trade disputes into something visceral, not tariffs, not treaties, not contracts, an ear, a wound, a violation. By 1739, Walpole's resistance was crumbling under the weight of public fury and political pressure. Britain declared war on Spain in October of that year. The War of Jenkins Ear had begun. At first, many Britons expected a quick, profitable conflict. Spain's American empire looked like a ripe fruit ready to be plucked. British sea power was strong, the Royal Navy was experienced, and the Caribbean was full of targets, ports, treasure routes, and fortresses that guarded the flow of wealth. The early moves seemed to justify the confidence. In November 1739, British forces under Admiral Edward Vernon struck the Spanish port of Portobello on the Isthmus of Panama. Portobello wasn't just a town, it was a key node in Spain's treasure system, a place where silver and goods moved and where imperial authority was meant to feel solid. Vernon attacked with a relatively small squadron and captured it quickly. In Britain, the victory caused an explosion of celebration. Vernon became a hero. Songs were written, medals were minted, the public drank to his name, and one enduring rumor says that the patriotic song "Rule Britannia" emerged in this atmosphere of naval triumph and imperial confidence.
Portobello convinced many that Spain would collapse if Britain pushed hard enough. So Britain planned a much larger blow, the kind of strike that would not merely embarrass Spain, but shatter its hold on the Americas. The target was Cartagena de Indias, in present-day Colombia, one of the most heavily fortified ports in the Spanish Caribbean. Cartagena was the lock on a treasure chest. It guarded the routes that connected the northern coast of South America to the wider Atlantic world. It had thick walls, strong forts, and a harbor designed for defense. If Britain took Cartagena, it could threaten the entire Spanish imperial system. In 1741, Admiral Vernon returned with a massive expedition. The numbers were staggering for the era, a huge fleet and tens of thousands of men, including British regulars and colonial troops from North America. It was one of the largest amphibious assaults Britain had attempted in the 18th century. The British expected glory. What they found was a nightmare. Cartagena's defense was commanded by a man whose name deserves to be remembered, Blas de Lezo. He was a Spanish admiral hardened by war and injury. Over his career, he had lost a leg, an arm, and an eye. He was, in the most literal sense, a man held together by stubbornness and will. And in 1741, that will stood between Britain and the Caribbean. The siege of Cartagena became a grinding contest of fortifications, firepower, and disease. The British had numbers and ships. The Spanish had defenses, leadership, and the advantage of fighting on ground designed to kill attackers. The British assaulted key positions, including the fortress of San Felipe de Barajas, a powerful stronghold that dominated the approaches. The fighting was fierce, confused, and brutal. Ladders were raised, men fell, smoke choked the night. And as the assault stalled, another enemy worked more efficiently than any Spanish cannon.
Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery. In tropical warfare, disease was often the decisive force, and at Cartagena it tore through the British ranks. Soldiers weakened, then collapsed. Camps became hospitals, hospitals became morgues. The heat and humidity turned wounds septic and water foul. The expedition that had sailed with such confidence began to rot from within. Vernon and the army commander, General Thomas Wentworth, quarreled. Coordination broke down. Time slipped away, and Blas de Lezo held. By the time the British withdrew, the failure was catastrophic. Thousands upon thousands were dead, many from disease. The grand victory that Parliament and the public had expected became an embarrassment so severe that it was almost suppressed. In Britain, triumphal medals celebrating the capture of Cartagena had been prepared in advance. They suddenly looked ridiculous. The War of Jenkins Ear was no longer a simple story of British strength and Spanish weakness. It was a reminder that empires were defended not just by fleets, but by fortresses, climate, and men who refused to break. The conflict also spread beyond the Caribbean. In North America, British and Spanish forces skirmished along the frontiers of Florida and Georgia. In 1740, James Oglethorpe, the founder of Georgia, launched attacks against Spanish Florida, aiming at St. Augustine. The siege bogged down. The Spanish held their ground. Raids and counter-raids turned the borderlands into a zone of fear and uncertainty, where small engagements carried the weight of imperial ambition. At sea, privateers swarmed. British privateers preyed on Spanish shipping. Spanish privateers struck back. Merchant crews sailed with anxiety, knowing that capture meant imprisonment, loss, and sometimes violence. The Caribbean became a chessboard where every convoy, every harbor, every reef could decide a fortune. And then, as if the war needed to prove it was never truly about Jenkins at all, the conflict expanded into something much larger. In 1740, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI died, triggering a European crisis over succession. The result was the War of the Austrian Succession, a sprawling struggle that pulled in the great powers of Europe. Britain, France, Spain, Austria, Prussia, and others collided in shifting alliances and battlefields stretching from Central Europe to the Mediterranean. The War of Jenkins Ear did not end.
it was absorbed. What had begun as a fight over Caribbean trade and maritime rights became one theater in a global contest of empire. In British minds, Spain was the enemy in the Americas, but France was the looming rival everywhere. Spain and France, bound by Bourbon family ties and shared interests, moved closer. Britain found itself fighting in multiple arenas, its resources stretched, its strategy complicated. The war's character changed. It was no longer simply about Spanish coast guards and British merchants. It was about balance of power. It was about who would dominate trade routes, colonies, and the seas. It was about whether Britain could expand without being checked by a coalition of European rivals. And yet, even as the war became global, the Caribbean remained a brutal proving ground. Consider the logistics alone. To fight in the West Indies, Britain had to send ships, men, food, medicine, gunpowder, and replacements across the Atlantic. Storms scattered fleets, supplies spoiled, scurvy weakened sailors, and every delay gave disease more time to spread in crowded ships and camps. Spain's system had its own problems. It struggled with corruption, slow communications, and limited naval strength compared to Britain. But it had something crucial: defensive depth. Its ports were fortified, its commanders understood the terrain, and it could concentrate resources at key choke points. The British learned, painfully, that capturing a Spanish port was not the same as holding it, and holding it was not the same as profiting from it. The war also revealed how deeply the American colonies were becoming entangled in imperial conflict. Colonial troops fought alongside British regulars. Colonial merchants supplied expeditions. Colonial privateers hunted prizes. The colonies were not just spectators, they were participants, and they were learning lessons about war, sacrifice, and the priorities of the empire. In the background, the public narrative still clung to the simplicity of Jenkins' Ear. It was a story that made sense to ordinary people. Spain had mutilated a British subject, and Britain had responded. But the reality was that the war was driven by hard calculations about trade and empire, and by political pressure at home. Robert Walpole, the man who had tried to keep Britain out of war, did not survive politically. By 1742, he was out of office. War had helped unseat him, as wars often do to those who resist them. The irony is sharp. The war that had been demanded with such patriotic certainty became long, expensive, and indecisive. As the 1740s continued, Britain fought on multiple fronts. In Europe, British forces and allies faced France and its partners. At sea, navies maneuvered for advantage. In North America, colonial conflict simmered and flared, a prelude to even larger wars later in the century. In the Caribbean, the dream of cracking Spain's empire wide open never fully materialized. Britain could strike, Britain could raid, Britain could win battles, but Spain's colonial system, battered and stressed, did not collapse. And that, in itself, is one of the most important truths of the war. The Spanish Empire in the Americas was not a hollow shell. It was resilient. It could absorb blows. It could adapt. It could produce leaders like Blas de Lezo, administrators who tightened defenses, and local militias that fought for their towns. For Britain, the war's most lasting impact may have been psychological. Portobello had inflated expectations. Cartagena destroyed them. The public learned that empire was not just a map to be colored in. It was a struggle measured in fever, mud, and mass graves. By 1748, Europe was exhausted. The War of Austrian Succession was grinding toward settlement, and with it the entangled conflicts across the globe. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, signed in 1748, largely restored the status quo in Europe and did not deliver dramatic territorial changes in the Americas from the War of Jenkins Ear. The great, decisive imperial breakthrough that British hawks had promised never came. So, what was gained? Britain had demonstrated naval reach and the ability to mount enormous expeditions even if they failed. Spain had proven it could defend key ports and endure. Both empires had spent blood and treasure. Merchants had lost ships. Sailors had died far from home. Colonial frontiers had been burned and raided. and the world had watched as a localized dispute became part of a global war machine.
And what of Robert Jenkins himself, the man whose ear became a casus belli? He fades into the fog of history, as symbols often do once they've served their purpose. The war that bore his name moved far beyond him. His ear, whether preserved, displayed, or mythologized, became less a piece of evidence than a piece of storytelling. And that is the unsettling lesson at the heart of this conflict. The War of Jenkins Ear shows how easily empires can be pushed into war by a single emotionally charged narrative, not because the narrative is false necessarily, but because it is simple. It is human. It fits into a sentence, into a headline, into a speech that makes people feel righteous. An ear, an insult, a demand for honor. But behind that symbol were merchants who wanted access to forbidden markets, politicians who wanted power, and states that understood trade as the lifeblood of empire. Behind it were treaties written with loopholes, coast guards operating with brutality, and a Caribbean economy fueled by smuggling and slavery. And once the war began, it did what wars so often do. It grew, it spread, it merged with other conflicts until the original cause seemed almost quaint, almost absurd compared to the scale of suffering and ambition unleashed. In the end, the war did not redraw the map in bold strokes. It did something more subtle and more dangerous. It hardened rivalries, it taught lessons, it set patterns. Britain learned that Spain could not be easily bullied out of the Americas. Spain learned that Britain would keep pressing, probing, and challenging its monopoly. The American colonies learned that they could be mobilized for imperial wars and that the consequences would land on their shores as surely as any enemy fleet. And Europe learned once again that the world was becoming one battlefield. A skirmish in the Caribbean could shake politics in London, influence alliances in Madrid and Paris, and fold into a continental struggle over crowns and succession. So when you hear the name War of Jenkins Ear, don't picture a strange footnote, a quirky anecdote from the age of sail. Picture a world where trade was war by other means, and war was trade by other means. Picture empires that measured dignity in body parts and profit in cargo holds. Picture a severed ear held up as proof that war was necessary, even inevitable. Because the real story is not that an ear sparked war. The real story is that empires were already loaded like cannons, and all they needed was a spark small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. And once that spark caught, it burned across oceans.